Story 1. Chester Bennington was supposed to go to his concert a few months after his passing. I never got to witness my favorite band live. Story 2. Probably Cameron Boyce. I grew up watching him, and it just felt different. He was so young too. Felt like a piece of my childhood left with him. Story 3. John Candy. He truly was a genuine person, an empathetic human being, and someone I not only wished I could have met, but also hugged. That would have been the closest thing to a religious experience for a fan who wanted to express how much he meant to me and how important his work was in improving my mental health by consistently making me smile and laugh. He made everything he was in better and brought so much joy to many. I was deeply saddened when he died. Story 4. Jim Henson. I watched a lot of the Muppets as a kid and can remember where I was and what I was doing when I read that he had passed away. Story 5. Corey Monteith from Glee passed away around the same time as my sister, and they were the same age. I always associate them together, and it was very sad. It still is. Story 6. John Lennon. I was in 6th grade and knew nothing about the Beatles or much music in English. Seeing on TV how many people cried and held vigils around the world for Lennon fascinated me. I wanted to understand what made people react so deeply to a singer. This led to my discovering the Beatles, and I was hooked. It was the gateway into music in English, especially rock. Story 7. I grew up watching Jeopardy and had been taking the online test for almost 10 years, hoping to be on the show someday. I got a copy of Alex Trebek's book just before he died and still haven't found the courage to read it because I know it will make me cry. I also have 2 of his Funko Pops that were gifts. Ken Jennings is a perfect host, and I am just as excited to be on the show one day to meet him, having watched every episode of his original run. Story 8. Elvis. I was 4 when my mom started to cry in the bright yellow kitchen, with the sun streaming in. She wept as if her heart had broken. Story 9. John Candy passed away when I was 9 years old. I remember my mom telling me about it. It was one of those moments when you can vividly recall where you were and what you were doing when it happened. It was the first time I experienced that feeling of shock and sadness over the death of a movie star. Story 10. Brittany Murphy. I was a teenager during Christmas time, and I remember wrapping presents when I saw it on the news. I always loved her movies and thought she was funny and cool. Truly broke my heart, and it still does. Story 11. Does Columbine count? I remember coming home from school and how my mom acted while watching it on TV. Story 12. Betty White and Technoblade are both memorable figures, but Technoblade impacted me more deeply. I found out about Betty's passing years after it happened, as I only learned of her through a movie where a mean boss marries her employee to maintain U.S. citizenship and avoid deportation to Canada. Story 13. Michael Jackson was different for me than for others. I never cared about stars or celebrities. When I worked at Twitter, I noticed the systems suddenly started to fail. Chatter was all around. Something was happening. As I investigated, I saw rumors that Jackson had died. Soon, the murmurs turned into a wave of activity, and we broke a record for the highest number of tweets per second, 451. After that, 451 tweets per second became known as 1MJ. Less than a year later, we experienced a moment where we had fewer tweets per second than 1MJ. That was the first time I realized that people could collectively react to death in such a way. It truly opened my eyes to the social dynamics of the world. Story 14. Frankly, Betty White. I have never been one to follow celebrities or let their lives affect me. Nevertheless, I was at work when I received the news. I identify as queer and have always admired her. A manager from a different department, who is also queer, came and shared the news with my manager and me. We promptly went home and cried over cheesecake. Story 15. Phil Hartman. It's strange that I cared so much as a preteen, but I definitely remember feeling sad about it. Story 16. I remember coming home from a sporting event. It must have been a baseball game. My mother was on the couch crying. Elvis Presley had passed away. It affected me because of how distraught my mother was for a long time. It impacted her deeply. Story 17. Bob Saget caused me emotional pain. I loved him greatly and listened to his podcast daily. He was a funny and kind person. Story 18, Steve Irwin. I couldn't understand how he could be killed by a stingray. I never knew they had barbed tails. Story 19. Not a death, but I was absolutely devastated by Lucy and Desi's divorce. I lay awake at night wondering whether it could happen to my parents. Story 20. My dad is a huge John Denver fan. I was 6 months old the first time I saw him in concert and 6 or 7 the last time. Little 9-year-old me was so sad when he died. I cried all morning. In contrast, a few months earlier, I hadn't even heard of Princess Diana until the night she died, when my aunt broke down in such screaming sobs that I initially feared my uncle had died. 97 was a big year. Story 21. Stevie Ray Vaughan. I was in college and had just started getting heavily into rock, blues, and blues rock, especially Stevie Ray Vaughan. It didn't help that I was a student at the University of Illinois and he died at Alpine Valley. It truly affected me. I still miss him. Story 22. Chester Bennington passed away when I was recovering from inpatient care after a suicide attempt. I listened to Linkin Park for hours because it helped me cope. My mom was worried I would relapse since she knew how much I loved their music. I couldn't listen to them for years because his death affected me deeply. I finally returned to their music after almost 4 years when I became a senior in high school. Story 23. Chris Farley. I was 7 when he died. I actually cried and thought about death every day for a year. I think about him from time to time. Story 24. Princess Diana was the first person whose death truly affected me. I felt as though the world had lost someone uniquely special that day. In contrast, when Jerry Falwell died, I felt the opposite. It was as if the world had become a little lighter and brighter that day. Story 25. John Candy. I was in college and saw the newspaper at the diner after being out all night. Couldn't believe it. Story 26. None really come to mind, but after listening to Willie Nelson's last album, I can tell his death is going to affect me. So I'm giving you a future answer. Story 27. Michael Jackson was always present, whether in positive or negative light. He was one of the most famous individuals in modern history, achieving immense success and attracting significant controversy. After his passing, many of the most downloaded songs on iTunes were his. Story 28. RFK and his assassination. My mom dropped me off late at school, and I remember walking into my second-grade classroom with my teacher writing "assassination" on the chalkboard. Story 29. Fred Rogers. I was still young and remember watching an episode, only to find out he had died. That was traumatic. Story 30. Chris Cornell. I genuinely felt pain when my dad told me. I wanted to see him perform live before he finished. Story 31. Jim Henson was the first one who had a significant impact on me. The Muppets, Sesame Street, and Fraggle Rock were major influences during my childhood. My parents weren't exactly great, and I feel like I learned so much about life from his work. Story 32. Beyond the hugely popular figures like Michael Jackson and Steve Irwin, I must mention Billy Mays from the OxyClean commercials. I was about 10 years old, and it was such a surprising moment. Story 33. Kurt Cobain was a source of hope for many teenagers who felt lost and alone. Nirvana's music served as a lifeline for them. Then, Kurt passed away. Story 34. Gord Downie was an iconic figure. Celebrity deaths usually don't impact me, but Ken Block was another person whose passing affected me. Story 35. Mac Miller had a unique way of channeling emotions through his music, and it felt like he was just beginning to explore the depths of the artist he would become. Story 36. Probably Elvis. I wasn't alive when he died, but I remember asking my mom at a young age what killed him, and she said drugs. He was not the last person I was aware of dying from drug-related issues, but he was certainly the earliest. I have always been cautious around drugs and the people whose lives are destroyed by seeking temporary solutions to permanent problems. Story 37. Robin Williams felt like losing the voice of my childhood and a genuinely kind soul at the same time. Story 38. Lane Staley from Alice in Chains. Not so much me, but a friend in college. We were eating in the cafeteria when MTV News came on. This guy stopped eating mid-bite, stared at the TV for a few minutes, then got up and walked out. He didn't see, speak to, or leave his room for 3 days. I thought it was kind of ridiculous to react to the death of a person you never even met in that way. It affected me to see some people really have a hard time accepting that they will never get a new experience with a person, even though they never had one with that person. Story 39. John Ritter. I was 14 and obsessed with reruns of Three's Company and 8 Simple Rules. When I heard he passed away, I cried for him more than I have cried over the deaths of family members. It has been over 20 years, and I still miss him so much. Story 40. Freddie Mercury only revealed his AIDS diagnosis a day or so beforehand. He had no obligation to disclose this to anyone, but I was a huge fan and a child, so I didn't realize his changing physical appearance was a cause for concern. My parents tried to shield me from it, but I remember my radio alarm waking me up with a Queen song. At first, I was excited because they didn't usually play Queen in the morning, but then they announced he had died. Story 41. Nepali Royal Family Massacre. The Nepali people loved that family. It was later blamed on the intoxicated crown prince, but many do not believe that. Story 42. I may not be as old as this sounds, but I grew up listening to Frank Sinatra. I would watch old movies frequently, and his music, especially his version of Jingle Bells, was my favorite. I was just 5 years old when he passed away. I was so heartbroken. I couldn't believe it. At that age, I had no understanding of death. My mom got me a copy of the newspaper reporting his death, and I still have it today. Story 43. Alex Trebek. That one was so sad. I love Jeopardy, and no one can ever be as good as him, in my opinion. Ken is an incredible host, and I think he is making Alex proud for sure. But when I learned Alex was sick, I was devastated. That one hurt. Story 44. Chester Bennington. I'm not even that big of a Linkin Park fan, but it might have been the combination of that and Chris Cornell's death just months prior. I held my bass and cried, and I don't even know these people. Story 45. Mr. Hooper. The most heart-wrenching scene in a television show was on Sesame Street. Story 46. I was in elementary school, riding in the back of my mom's Ford LTD when the radio music cut short for the bulletin that Elvis had died. I had not yet experienced death, and it was a bit scary. The mother of a family friend told us kids that Elvis was not really dead and that he was coming to get her. She would give us cookies and talk excitedly about this turn of fortune, and we listened and believed her. Her granddaughter, who was my age, was so excited that she was getting a horse and new clothes. It created quite a stir. When you are young like that, especially in the late 20th century, mental illness was not discussed, and children were almost never included in conversations about it or any family drama. So the trauma was not only about the death of Elvis, but also about the memory of a family matriarch losing her sanity. Story 47. Jim Henson. I still have the newspaper clipping from when they announced his death. The Muppets were a significant part of my childhood. I still love them today. I often wonder what the world would have been like if Jim had never caught pneumonia and had lived another 30 years. Story 48. Before I was born, John Lennon and Kurt Cobain had an impact on me. However, the first real event that deeply affected me was when Dimebag Darrell was murdered on stage in 2004. Story 49. Cameron Boyce and Angus Cloud. Boyce was a shock. We were not that far apart in age, and he was so young with a lot of potential. He was starting to branch out from Disney by the time he passed. And Angus Cloud. That hit me hard. Fez in Euphoria was my favorite character. I wanted to see where his character would go after the season 2 finale, as well as his relationship with Lexi. Beyond the character, he seemed like a chill person with a kind soul. Story 50. I loved Princess Leia and Star Wars so much as a kid that I dressed up as Princess Leia for Halloween once. My mom styled my hair into those 2 side buns. Her death saddened me greatly. My mom and I used to have Star Wars movie marathons often, so it felt like a punch to the gut as a devoted fan of the franchise. When Harrison Ford eventually passes, it will likely evoke a similar reaction. Story 51. Avicii was a significant part of my life when I was 17. His music helped me through tough times, and it's really sad to know that I will never get any new music from him. I will always cherish his work and continue to listen to his songs. Story 52, Neil Peart. I felt like it was evidence that I was getting older and my heroes would not be around forever. Story 53, Liam Payne is the only famous death that has ever affected me. I am in my 40s and wasn't really a fan of him or his bandmates before he passed away. Story 54, Dimebag Darrell and Doug Hopkins. I wasn't the biggest fan of Pantera or Gin Blossoms, but I remember feeling like we lost a significant force in the guitar and songwriting communities with both of their deaths. Story 55. Robin Williams was a significant part of my life growing up. My family watched Mrs. Doubtfire frequently. Story 56. Princess Diana. I wasn't into the whole royal family, but the way it happened, combined with everyone's reactions, really brought perspective. Story 57. George Carlin was a significant figure, and I still mourn his loss. His material remains relevant even today, but I can only imagine what he would be saying if he were still with us. Story 58. The first heavy celebrity loss was Mitch Hedberg. I discovered him about 6 months prior, and I listened to all of his work so much that I memorized it. Then he died, and my 16-year-old heart was broken. Robin Williams affected me deeply. I still feel sad about him. Story 59. Princess Diana. I was around 10 years old at the time, and I remember crying the night they announced it. At that age, I wasn't really aware of famous people, but I understood that she was a good, kind person, and she had children almost my age. It really made me feel a sense of loss. Story 60. Princess Diana. I was about 12 years old, and it was the envelope on the casket with "Mum" written on it that deeply affected me. Story 61. Whitney Houston. Growing up in the 1980s, I loved her music. My kindergarten teacher would start every class with us singing "The Greatest Love of All," which we also performed at our kindergarten graduation. Whitney's music was a significant part of my childhood. When she passed away, it felt like a part of my childhood died too. Story 62. Robin Williams' death was the first celebrity loss that really affected me. However, the celebrity death that stands out the most was Michael Jackson's death. I was about 13, and it genuinely had an eerie and haunting energy. Anytime someone mentioned it, I felt my anxiety spike. I honestly have no idea why, and I was not aware of the information we now know about Michael Jackson and the conspiracies surrounding his life and death. For that reason, I believe it had a significant impact on my spiritual beliefs. Story 63. I was just shy of turning 5, but I remember when Jim Henson died. It really upset my older sister and my mom. Even my dad, who usually didn't care about celebrities, expressed sadness about it. Thank goodness the Muppets, Sesame Street, and his brand have endured. His legacy is all the joy and love he gave us, and we, his fans, continue to share that with the world. I'm definitely a better person for having grown up with Jim Henson's works in my life. Story 64. Michael Jackson. I was too young to fully understand the allegations against him. All my 8-year-old self knew was that he made music I really liked, even if the Thriller music video scared me. I was truly saddened by his passing. Story 65. Cameron Boyce. I never really paid attention to any other celebrity deaths before, but for some reason, even though I wasn't a big fan of his, I still cried hard when I learned he died. Felt awful. Story 66. Technoblade. It still affects me a little bit to this day. I don't think I will ever grieve for a celebrity like that again. He was special. Story 67. Selena Quintanilla. I remember that's when I really felt a cultural difference because everyone around me was asking, "Who?" And I was like, "Selena." It was the first time I felt different. Story 68. Rick Mayall. I used to watch everything he was in. He always made me laugh and brought so much to his characters. I was at work when I found out, and it ruined my whole day. I was so sad. Story 69. 1. Selena. I grew up in the United States as a Hispanic who didn't speak Spanish. There was some shame involved with being of Hispanic descent because of the environment I was raised in. As I became a teenager, I tried to immerse myself in my culture to overcome that shame. When I first heard Selena, I felt seen. Her voice was beautiful, and her songs made me feel something. I became a huge fan. My grandmother, who only spoke Spanish, was thrilled that I was embracing my culture and native tongue. I would sing her songs at the top of my lungs. I remember a great bonding moment when my mom walked into my room and saw me trying to pause the cassette so I could write down the lyrics and translate them into English. It was a cherished moment I didn't get to have too often with my mom. When Selena passed away, I was getting home from school, and my grandma was sitting outside my house. This was unusual, so I sensed something was off. My siblings ran inside, but she called me over and asked me to have a seat. She broke the news to me as if a family member had passed away. As expected, I burst into tears. It was a very emotional moment. Lucille Ball, honorable mention. I remember being a teenager in the early 1990s and watching classic television shows like Bewitched and I Love Lucy. I fell in love with Lucille Ball. I wished so much that I could have met her or existed in a time when I could have seen her show live. When I discovered she had recently passed, I was devastated. I felt robbed of an opportunity. I felt as if I had just discovered her in my life, and she was already gone. Story 70. None of them have. I feel a bit sad that they are gone. However, I have never mourned or become really upset about a celebrity's death. I do not understand people who do. You do not know them. They are not family. Story 71. I remember the impact of Michael Jackson. It affected me deeply, making me cry and mourn for Corey Monteith. Story 72. Considered John F. Kennedy a celebrity? I was 10 and remember the day well. It was a warm Friday afternoon, and I was playing with my school friend Bill Roop, who lived right next to our elementary school. His mother came out crying, and I had to call my mom to come pick me up. Story 73. Elvis Presley. I was 14 years old while traveling in Italy in 1977 and was surprised at how sad the Italians were as well. Story 74. Michael Jackson. I was 15, and a lady in the apartment complex where we lived was sitting in her car with the passenger door open when we pulled up. She was crying, and I looked at her in shock. She wailed, "Michael Jackson is dead." I just remember saying, "No way," and walking towards our apartment. Story 75. Possibly a little more niche than some, but for me it was Shirley Strachan. I can remember sitting in the front passenger seat of my family car when I was 9 years old when the broadcast announcing his death came on the radio. I was a huge Skyhooks fan. It was probably one of the first times that I realized the concept of mortality in any meaningful way. It was also the first time I felt like I didn't deserve to be sad because it was someone I only knew from music and television, not someone in my life. To this day, listening to Skyhook songs makes me feel down. Story 76. Adam Rich from 8 is Enough. I had only watched the show a couple of times, but it was somehow horrible. Maybe it was because I still saw him as that little kid. Story 77. I cried when I heard that Robin Williams had passed away. I knew him from Mrs. Doubtfire and Jumanji. The ending of the former still makes me tear up. I saw the news on television that night. It was a rough day. Story 78. Elvis was a significant figure in music. My mom was a huge fan, so we watched every special and televised concert of his from Hawaii. She was in tears all day when we heard he had died. I was in complete disbelief that he could have possibly passed away. Story 79. I watched Hook the other day and told a friend how much I missed Robin Williams. He was such a joy. Story 80. Elvis. I was 6. My tooth had fallen out that morning, but my tooth fairy was in mourning and forgot about me. Story 81. Princess Diana. I was just shy of 11 years old. Not that I really knew who she was, being American and young enough that I was not fully aware of the royal family. However, I remember being at my friend's house and his mom was really upset about it, as well as the fallout that occurred afterward. Story 82. Top 5. 1. Steve Irwin. 2. Whitney Houston. 3. Michael Jackson. 4. Robin Williams. 5. Liam Payne. Honorable mention. Christina Grimmie. Story 83. Elvis. I was 9 and it was all over the radio. Television wasn't big in our house at the time. I was sad because everyone else was. He was only 42, closer to my son's age than my son is to mine. Story 84. Princess Diana. I watched her dare to marry Prince Charles. It was very tragic the way she died. Story 85. Elvis Presley in 1977. I was 17, and although I was not a huge fan, it was a big deal. John Lennon in 1980. Again, a big deal. Two music icons I grew up with. Then Princess Diana. I was married, we had been separated for about a year, and 3 months earlier we decided to try and make it work. It wasn't working. When Princess Diana died at such a young age, I thought life's too short and filed for divorce the next week. Story 86. The voice actress of Disney's Cinderella. When I was a child, I thought I would never see or hear anything about her again. Her voice was incredibly captivating. Story 87. River Phoenix is the first one that I can remember, followed by Kurt Cobain, unless we are counting Krista McAuliffe as a celebrity. I was 9 when the Challenger blew up. Story 88. JFK, so you can see I'm old. Everyone was crying. Teachers let us out early. Men came home from work early. I was 7 and the world changed that day. Then, of course, there were many deaths. Robert F. Kennedy, Martin Luther King Jr., Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, you grow immune. Then after that, it was Bowie. Story 89, Cameron Boyce. I watched him on Disney when he was on Jessie. Later, when I began following the news more closely, I saw his face and the announcement of his death. It was a shock because he was around my age and far too young. Story 90, Jim Henson. I was only a child, but I admired him greatly as an artist and hoped to work with him one day, and then he was gone. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.